Why has nothing been done about the lack of consciousness? If I may call it that. So why haven't the species of this club found any other compensation or solution? Why do they go on as before? That they believe that this kind of parasitic erosion and digital adaptation of other species to the club is natural?
As I said, this is based on their philosophy and ideology, the redefinition and appropriate adjustment of their moral views. Also because they found out that in this way they can also get the individuals of a species, from whom they suck the free will, i.e. the quanta of their consciousness or soul, better under the control of their digitization program. It is much easier to get a species such as humanity, which has a more limited free will as a result of the suction, to get them to join the researchers' club. The club thus justified it according to the motto that the better you can suck the free will out of a species, the more likely that species is destined to belong to them. It redefined it ideologically and philosophically in such a way that the easier it is to take the free will away from a species, the more clearly it is necessary to make it a species of the club, because a higher spiritual development is rather excluded. So if a species does not defend itself against this anyway, it would be, in the opinion of the club, a mutual fulfillment, which the club would thus comply with in a kind of predestination. In this definition, the club has also cemented it in its philosophical ideology.
That sounds kind of self-righteous and digressive for this kind of creature, which is supposed to be so highly intelligent. Somehow completely illogical, inconsistent. I thought they were all judgmental and highly intelligent. Didn't they say goodbye to their own intellectual principles with such an attitude?
Yes, of course. But there are historical reasons for this, which took place within the club. The philosophical views and interpretations about the meaning and purpose of the club were determined solely by the pragmatic intellectual founding species. But there are now many different species. Some of them come close to the intelligence of the founding species. Others do not, but have been intellectually enhanced by digitalization, while retaining their emotional volatility. And this was naturally incorporated into the changes of the club, especially when faced with the problems of quantum resolution.
Aha. Okay, then let's say that this does not contradict the logical principles of the highly intelligent species of this club?
But of course, here the cat bites its own tail. The species with a very high intellect have long known that they made mistakes in founding their club. But the high intelligence of the few founder species now rather proves itself by the fact that they at least know how to persevere and keep the status quo so as not to die. That is why their club is now also intellectually so pragmatic. And for that, they need other beings to join them, because they can suck those beings to be joined out for a very long time before they can effectively suck them out on a quantum level. They often artificially prolong the process of affiliation. But even the official integration strippers within the club know that.
A rather tricky development. Now I come back to the question I asked earlier, while you were in the process of answering it. It just burns my nails. What about the intergalactic travel of this club? You beam from one place to another, so to speak. In one and the same moment?
Yes, you change to another place in an instant. But that is not beaming of matter, it works on other bases. Basics of quantum physics, which have already been given to mankind today normally by great physicists and developers, because mankind will have to be tuned for their digital transformation in the coming epochs.
And there will be no longer flight? So there are no spaceships? Only devices through which you are transmitted from one place to another?
Actually, you are not transmitted like data, but you actually arrive in the same quantum materiality, a negative, which is then digitally reinterpreted upon arrival into the original positive. In order to be able to travel in this way, however, the digital biological storage previously carried out with the body is necessary. Only in this way can they travel to distant places at all or, by force, attain eternal life. Whether you want to see some of this as an advantage or a disadvantage is up to you. Digitization is both a blessing and a curse.
So every route can be covered in an instant, no matter how far away the destination is?
Yes. But spaceships are also used. Virtual spaceships.
Oh, now spaceships after all?
Yes, you need these so-called spaceships to get to places that are located between quantum entangled places where no transmitting and receiving devices are installed. For this purpose, a material spaceship is digitized and transferred into a virtual reality in which the ship exists like a hologram, but still acts as a virtual holographic part in the material world. When traveling with such spaceships, there are predetermined routes which are followed like railway tracks. To make this possible, the entire track route consists of something that, simplified for humans, could be called quantum state track projectors, which reproduce the patterns of the entire spaceship and its passengers in quantum entangled digital form, virtually and holographically, so to speak, for the entire journey. Of course, the individuals on board such a spaceship must then be permanently put into their quantum interlaced digital state in order to be able to travel holographically and virtually. In this way, individuals within such a virtual spaceship really travel a distance of the material world. They can vary their speed along the way as if they were flying in a real material spaceship. Due to the quantum track projectors, they can also simply stop their ship at any time, materialize completely and then act as material beings in space and then simply return to their digital state and continue their journey on the rails of the track projectors, further exploring the material world. The club travels a very large part of space in this way, because otherwise it would not be able to explore the enormous spaces between its setup start and finish devices. Also, in this holographic virtuality, all the different species of the club interact barrier-free with each other. Moreover, this state is used almost exclusively by most of the individuals of the club, because through it there are very many options for existence and action. Traveling with a spaceship is actually exactly what everyone imagines by the term space travel. And actually it is also the most interesting thing about traveling. One travels with this technology almost as it is described in science fiction films. At least in the broadest sense, in the holographic virtual sense.
Actually, that doesn't sound bad at all. It's a way to truly travel around in space, even in between. Does that mean that this holographic or virtual reality in or with the spaceships not only eliminates the problems of speed, but also the problems of temporal relativity?
Yes. These problems do not exist then. That is the great advantage. In order to be able to cover long distances, you can use only these technical principles. This is the only way to travel efficiently and effectively interstellarly. All other possibilities to overcome the long distances and spaces of the universe are cumbersome, strongly restrictive, or simply not possible. There are other techniques to travel, but because this is traveling with matter, only the species of other clubs that have consciously chosen to stay on their planets and only travel back and forth between some of their respective populated adjacent solar systems use this. They use propulsion systems with which they can reach almost the speed of light. This creates considerable disadvantages in terms of temporal relativity for a longer journey. They therefore fly back and forth between a few stars at most. And only a few individuals of their species do that. But for more than 3 millennia now there has been a club of spiritual species that have managed to cover smaller distances, traveling interplanetary without having to use any means of transport or quantum entanglements. To do this, they use their genome in combination with light, which produces a transformation that makes them perform amazing things. They will one day be something like spiritually traveling beings, with other amazing possibilities of consciousness. This club is currently competing strongly with the club of researchers who are stalking the Earth philosophically and transcendently. Because they are on the verge of being able to travel interstellar with the sound of their genome, and with a little support and cooperation they can go much further.
You mean, the spiritually evolving species will evolve in such a way that they can travel through space just like that? Like Q from Star Trek? We already had that in our last interview.
You like Star Trek, don't you? Well, I know this character from the series, and if you have to try this series, then, yes, they will be like the Q. Only not with those negative, selfish and exaggeratedly destructive parts that are so grotesquely and absurdly presented in Star Trek with this one being. Well, the great discoverer and explorer club that is stalking humanity is still the hippest and most ruling club when it comes to the exploration and study of the universe. And they are extremely successful and well organized. And nobody has bothered them until now. They are masters of traveling, discovering, exploring and mastering the universe, and also of robbing the soul. But all this will change.
If we do not resist this club of researchers, would humanity one day become just as digitalist and travel around in space?
Yes, it would, if it had been digitized. But because of the process that has been initiated, humanity will no longer be tempted to have to exist and travel in this way. Humanity will take a different path. However, it will use this type of digital travel for several centuries to the extent that it will send spaceships with androids on their travels, which will then glide along virtually holographically on their own quantum track projectors. In this way we will make contact with spiritual species for the first time.
What? What does that mean? Mankind travels digitally after all, in other words quantum-wise?
No, not mankind itself. Mankind will build artificial beings, empty robots without consciousness, which will be sent on journeys through space in a virtual digital state in quantum-locked spaceships. These empty robots without consciousness will then be controlled live by us on Earth, like a drone, an avatar or an android. In this way it is possible to look around in space in comfort. Spiritual species also use this method to travel around interstellar and space. You don't have to travel yourself, You don't have to become digital yourself to be able to be active in space. After an episode of looking around in space, humanity and other spiritual species will then enter a completely different plane of being. And for this, mankind will be very important.
Good. Now I have a question about how this quantum entanglement travel works. You said that the species in this club needed a device to allow an individual to materialize as a quantum negative in a different place, so to speak. So how do these species get the device to where they want to go? That is not possible with a quantum teleporter. For this they must have traveled there themselves with very slow spaceships in order to set up such a device there. And that means that the spreading of their influence must have been very slow and laborious.
Correct. That was and is a big problem in the spreading of the area of influence. They can only conquer undeveloped areas of the cosmos in the conventional way, with material, fast-flying spaceships, which then set up devices in the area of the cosmos to be conquered, from which the club species can then get out there. At this point I must perhaps also mention that stars and planets such as stations and train stations are connected in an intergalactically interwoven network. The distribution of these devices, let's call them here simply teleporters or transport gates, always takes a very long time even if you use spaceships that travel at almost the speed of light to place the teleporters there, at their destination. The construction of the quantum track projectors, on which holographic virtual spaceships will later glide along, is not so difficult to accomplish with these matter spaceships, but overall it is just as long. Well, the Researchers Club actually only ever spread out into new areas of space at near the speed of light. There it met and still meets today with considerable resistance of various kinds.
Aha.
However, there is something else important to mention here. A large part of the route network used by the club and the transportation gates are very, very old. This route network was created by the disappeared predecessor species, which I mentioned briefly and in the first interview.
Ah, yes. You meant that billions of years ago there existed species, which then found a way to change completely and permanently into a state, in order to cross over into dimension 4 to 6, became servants of the AI.
Yes, but the species itself is not the issue now. I only mean the web they have left behind. Well, the Researchers Club discovered something amazing when they installed their own track projectors and set up the transport gates. An ancient and 10% intact railway network from times long past that reached far into the depths of space.
That was then beneficial for the club? So it didn't take that long for them to spread out?
Yes, it brought a lot of benefits to the club. But the rediscovered network of routes and the transmission devices used by the Researchers Club were now used all by themselves. This was because after the wars the spiritual species were generally denied quantum entangled travel with avatars or androids in the network of the Researchers Club anyway. In return, the Researchers Club promised not to influence or digitize those spiritual species anymore. These were the agreements between the different clubs and species after their wars. And this was later applied to the use of the rediscovered network as a result of this peace treaty. So there was peace and tolerance, but there was never any access to any network for these spiritual species. Nor were there any exceptions for the digitization of single individuals of spiritual species.
Individuals of spiritual species do not want to be digitized anyway. So what kind of exceptions?
Yes, that could have been and could have happened. Because some individuals would certainly like to go digital anyway. It had to be stipulated in the contract that individuals of spiritual clubs are forbidden to become digital. Today this is the guideline for these clubs, so that a spiritually existing species as a whole does not deviate from it. This is what once led to the wars in question. So, guidelines and exclusion criteria were made binding on both sides, on the side of the researcher club and on the side of the spiritual clubs. It guaranteed spiritual beings a purely spiritual development, as well as in the reverse agreement for the researchers club to be allowed to spread further into space in accordance with their digitization plans and philosophy.
I see. But then these spiritual clubs with their old-fashioned space travel are completely excluded and sealed off from long interstellar journeys.
No. To be able to send their androids and robots, they first had to build up their own networks, which was a laborious and lengthy process, and, as I said, they were not allowed to use the huge network of the Explorers Club, which, with the discovery of the ancient network, enjoyed a huge advantage in the further expansion of its empire and in the control of space. But the construction of their own networks took a horribly long time compared to the speed at which the competing researcher club network was being developed, even though many spiritual species and spiritual clubs made cooperation agreements in order to be able to connect far-flung regions of the cosmos. Many spiritual species and clubs met halfway and then often agreed to use each other's networks. Making the overall network of all these spirituals larger, but the speed of expansion remained much slower than the ruling researcher club. They could only run behind, while still losing more and more ground. But something has changed in connection with the success of a spiritual club that has found out to use the analog genome not only for so-called supernatural experiences and the development of supernatural abilities, as all spiritual research species do, but also to use the genome in connection with light for a special form of locomotion and other cross-border abilities. There will be a breakthrough. Quantum data transmission will no longer be necessary. The forbidden access to the network of the researchers club has, so to speak, contributed to the fact that this development has been accelerated and taken up. And the ruling researchers club knows what this means for them in the future. Philosophical and ideological insolvency.
Why did the researchers club get this old network all to itself? The discovery of the net was after the wars, wasn't it? Had such a case been negotiated in the peace treaty beforehand?
No, the researchers club was not awarded this. But since in the individual peace treaties with spiritual species and clubs it had been negotiated that spiritual species or clubs were not or no longer allowed to share the network of the researchers club. This also indirectly affected the sharing or claim to this old network. When this network was discovered, the researchers club immediately simply added it to its network. There were no negotiations with the spiritual species afterwards. Compared to the species and clubs with which the researchers club was once at war, this is actually relatively understandable. The Researchers Club naturally also took this old network because it was intended to prevent a spiritual species from being given too many technical possibilities for expansion. Because of its digital quantum emergency, the Researchers Club must always strive to expand its realm without interference and as quickly as possible. It is therefore extremely bad to grant any rights to spiritual beings, because they have been happy to interfere in intergalactic influences on the Researchers Club. This is one of the reasons why there were always small wars between spiritualists and the Researchers Club before the Great War. Now there are all these contracts and regulations.
Okay. So, spiritual clubs or spiritual species now travel through space with something like avatars. And they send them through their own networks created in the universe and their distributed transportation gates? What about these spirituals now? Are they interfering in foreign affairs again?
Yes, these spiritual species are also passively interfering in the destinies of intelligent species again, for thousands of years. Now it is finally possible again. Although it is forbidden by contract and therefore can only take place in secret. But of course the Researchers Club is aware that they are interfering. That's how it always works. That is espionage. The androids sent to Earth by the spiritual clubs act like drones. Interstellar steerable drones that look like humans. Because they look almost perfectly human, these androids do not need a manipulation signal acting on the brain, as the alien individuals sent by the club that is watching us need to be able to pass as human beings on Earth. The androids of the spirituals are outwardly built like humans, but in some respects they seem a little clumsy, but they are nevertheless convincing. They are only for a few special missions on Earth. That is the only reason they were built. And they are in secret subterranean places, in a state of matter in which even the Researchers Club cannot detect them. Moreover, they must be absolutely inactive until they are used and must not have any connection to spiritual clubs, otherwise they will quickly be discovered. The big problem is that the species of the Researchers Club do not tolerate these androids on Earth at all. Furthermore, this intervention is a violation of the negotiated peace treaties. Therefore the androids of this spiritual species must appear as fast as lightning, act quickly and disappear again immediately. They are only ever very briefly in action. Always a very tricky game, because the main task of the androids is to take cloaked alien individuals of the Researchers Club with them for special treatment. To make such an action as undetected as possible, it always has to be done very quickly also so that the club does not notice which target individuals have been taken and treated. Human witnesses who get in the way are then also treated. However, no more than that can be said about all this.
Oh. That sounds like difficult secret operations.
Yes, the main problem with such operations is that the Explorers Club completely and rigorously seals off the Earth from the rest of the clubs in the universe. Very little information goes in and very little goes out. Not even current details about the earthly cultures, the political situation or the state of technical developments are sent out. Not even about culinary delicacies and lifestyles or people's interests, not even about music or fashion. Everything is kept under lock and key. This is the tactic of the Researchers Club to make it almost impossible to intervene on Earth with appropriately equipped androids.
Then the spiritual species and clubs must be quite frustrated and annoyed by this state of affairs. But because of the presence of these androids, the spiritual clubs at least have information about human culture and the conditions on Earth.
No, that's the problem. That's what I just meant. It just doesn't work that way. When working with androids, the spiritual clubs must do their utmost to avoid keeping them in direct active quantum connection or in permanent action. Because, depending on how the androids are brought into action, this would almost immediately be noticed by the researcher club. The spiritual clubs are glad that they could place scouts permanently on the planet at all. Although the androids are the only informers, they can only send some of their data and information after years or even decades. Moreover, androids were not built to provide primarily cultural information about the Earth, the people and their stalkers. This is rather a secondary task, which can only be analyzed when the androids have been brought home completely. And then, due to the amount of time that has passed, this cultural information is in many ways highly worthless. When the androids are in action, they are only used directly for a very short time, so you walk around with them only for a very short time. And so that the action remains relatively undiscovered and the action itself can remain completely secret, the androids are located on Earth in a very secret place and in a material state where they cannot be discovered or traced by anyone, not even by the Explorers Club, of course. Often the androids are not actively used for years, before they are finally exchanged after a few decades and hand over important information to the spiritual clubs. The reason for this is the conspicuous patterns that arise during an interstellar quantum data transfer. Therefore, the spiritual clubs cannot simply exchange their androids or transfer data or bring them home. A constant connection is not possible. But if these androids remain isolated on Earth, i.e., if they are transferred from their earthly hiding place to the Earth's surface for a mission only and then back to their hiding place, then at least their action and whereabouts can remain secret.
Can they not fulfill their tasks independently? Without an active quantum data connection? Aren't they androids?
Yes, you could let the androids carry out their actions independently, but this has always been avoided so far, as self-control makes it even more likely that they will attract inappropriate attention in certain situations and circumstances, as the spiritual clubs do not have sufficient knowledge of the worldly, cultural and social conditions on the planet. Because the researcher club shields everything. Due to missing details, the android program might not be able to react appropriately in some situations, whereby the androids would suddenly attract attention during their activity, i.e. towards extraterrestrial individuals on Earth, and there cannot and must not be such errors during these operations. Then the interventions would be over and there would possibly be considerable difficulties between the spirituals and the researcher club.
But through this interview the researchers club is warned. And you also said that they would somehow notice such actions. At least they suspect them. Isn't it possible that at some point they will take action against the spiritual clubs?
No, because there is no clear proof. And it is not known which spiritual club has interfered in each case. And altogether you cannot simply make a blanket accusation for each individual case. And yes, the researchers club has been warned anyway that there are spies running around on Earth. This is nothing new for it. But it must not catch them. This happened once about 2,500 years ago. But not since then.
Okay. So the researchers club has an attitude in which it creates an absolute isolation of humanity from the rest of the universe?
Yes, more extreme than the strongest isolationist attitude of any despot government or dictatorship ever on Earth. If the researchers' club notices in retrospect that there were actions of the androids that even people had noticed, they themselves stage fake visits with beings that resemble those androids. In this way they steer attention in a different direction, confuse and lull people into uncertainty about it.
So a complete confusion tactic? Annoying for those seeking the truth, so of course only if they are really looking for knowledge. Well, traveling with androids is actually the better way to research and discover in space. Also much safer. Why didn't the Explorers Club do the same from the beginning?
Well, why didn't the club do the same from the beginning? If the ruling researchers club hadn't acted too fast back then, a long time ago, and hadn't pushed through digitalization so quickly, and if it had known about all the great disadvantages of consciousness, it would probably have decided to travel with androids. But the times were favorable, the fusion with other species so interesting, the departure into the unknown so tempting. The possibilities of digitalization through quantum technology seemed so unlimited, fascinating and safe. And the AI from Dimension 7 always provided the drive and the desire to get started. Unfortunately, the whole thing then developed differently and the circumstances turned out to be extremely unfavorable for the ruling researchers and Discoverers Club. I mean that they cannot make their digital side biological analog again. Once digital, always digital, with the great disadvantage of decomposing consciousness. For this reason alone, it was worth the wait for the species of spiritual clubs or the late birth of other species. In addition, new, so-called genome-activating techniques are currently being developed. With the biological genome alone, it will be possible to become the purest light of another quantum system, to enter another, so to speak, open-world system, in order to be able to travel from there to any point of our material universe. On this basis, it will also be possible to completely escape the seven-dimensional total prison one day. And because of all these spiritual discoveries and innovations within the material and spiritual existence, the species of the Explorers Club will be in decline within the next 1,000 years. A horrible catastrophe of existence for them. But a rescue of their states of consciousness can be started, a way out can be sought. Whether this will work is open to question. And actually it depends on them, possibly in the end also on the Jiaowei AI, and even more on its unspecific producer, the potential programmer of this AI.
So I hear especially now that the Researchers Club has not drawn such a good fortune. And it is not a club you should definitely belong to. It seems to be nothing more than a huge parasite club.
Exactly. Secretly, the Researchers Club is no longer concerned with the primary goal of digitizing species, but at least as much with the efficient exploitation of quanta. And human consciousnesses have a particularly large number of them, which is why it is so worthwhile to milk these consciousnesses.
So the system of digitization is outdated?
Yes, among other things. It would be more appropriate to say it is insolvent.
And the club now wants to milk off quanta above all else? That's why it is delaying the digitization of many species that are influenced by it.
Yes, indeed, but the time has come for mankind to go digital, and now digitization is actually to be implemented. And even the ancient digital human nobility, which relies on this integration of mankind and is itself dependent on it, is not letting up. It will not and cannot let go from its pact with the club. Because only by joining the club can and may it continue to exist.
Then you have to admit that this nobility is quite selfish in this respect.
Yes, but both sides, club and nobility, benefit from this pact. Through the cooperation of the digital nobility, the club continues to receive its quantum from the species under surveillance, and conversely, the digital nobility is contractually assured by this cooperation that, should digitization fail, civilization will always make a fresh start. Because without future membership of the respective species in the club, the digital nobility would be finished. He would get no more quanta and would eventually have to die and become one-dimensional, and all beings of the corrupted rulers of the universe simply hang on to life and are afraid of the threatening decomposition of their consciousness and the one-dimensional existence that cannot be escaped from it again. They have just let themselves be persuaded to do so, have allowed themselves to be given presence and have been transformed into godlike eternally living beings. And although this quantum degradation is a great disadvantage for all digital beings, it is also the practical and ironic fact that this is exactly what ensures the cooperation between nobility and the club, everywhere in the universe, with all controlled species, by creating such dependent and greedy beings. In this way, the club can better control and influence. Digitalization is always a big problem for every living being, for spiritual beings perhaps even more so, because spiritual beings are always reborn in the same species. Every human being is reborn as a human being. We are only passing through with our present life, so to speak. And that is why the prevention of the biological digitalization of mankind should be very close to the heart of every human being personally.
Let me summarize. On this planet there are people running around who should have been dead a long time ago, but who can live forever thanks to this digital technology. And they are helping to push mankind into the digital direction, so that they can continue to live as they do now?
Yes. They are ancient nobility rulers from times long past. The core and the head come from the first extinct high-tech global civilization, many thousands of years ago. Others from the following high-tech global civilization, and still others from the cultural high civilizations that followed. And there were some of them. These people are the core. But new people have come and are still coming, so they are made digital. When they appear today, epigenetic changes only modulate their appearance and their stature temporarily, adapting them so that, with the help of photos or old paintings, it is at least not noticeable today who they were relatively recently. In other words, if they are forced to appear in public today, they have to show themselves, for example, because they now have to act as influential figures in the long term.
Does this mean that they now act as visible nobility of today's royal houses? You mentioned in the last interview that the digital nobility took over the high priesthood in the lost highly technical civilizations. So do they occupy something similar today? Religious institutions?
Yes, they always run religious institutions. But they tend to avoid appearing in them personally. That varies with high religious offices. It depends on the world situation they have constructed, whether they appear there themselves or not. And no, in the nobility of kingdoms, countries and states, these digital nobles are rather not to be found. Only their analog bloodlines operate there, their mortal descendants. Today, however, these analog bloodlines serve to influence world history in quite different ways, and less or not at all as kings or rulers. But many of these mortal descendants are also not properly initiated into their ancestry and the digital background of their ancestors and creators.
So it is blood relatives, analog blood relatives, of these digital noblemen who shape and determine the world?
Yes. This is for better control, because their genetics, i.e. the genetics of the analogs, are also suitably cobbled together by this descent from the digital nobility, in order to guarantee a dominant and absolute domination of the world through them. As I have already reported, the digital ones have implanted some genes that make them cool and dominant people. Genes of the founding species of the club. And these special genes are also present in the analog descendants that rule the world.
Then this digital nobility actually lives a pretty good life so far here on Earth. They don't have to do much themselves.
Yes, you might think so. But some individuals of the ancient digital nobility, some of the first digitally made people, felt the decomposition of consciousness on their own bodies right from the beginning, for almost 30,000 years now. And over the millennia, more and more of them have been in need of a supply of consciousness quanta. Therefore some of them literally need fresh meat every now and then.
Fresh meat?
Yes, fresh meat. Now this term is not a metaphorical expression, but exactly hits the core of their quest for quanta of consciousness. The purer the soul of the victim, the more unlocked the free will, the better for them. The more quanta can be harvested, far more than through the automatic feeding process of the club. The age-old digital human nobility is actually poorly off, because they have become zombies, vampires who, like the individuals of the extraterrestrial researcher club, need consciousness quanta from living beings in order to be able to continue to exist materially and mentally.
Oh.
Yes, oh. A digitally existing humanity would not, of course, suck off quanta in the same way as the digital nobility on Earth does now and then with a sacrifice in order to get a big bunch of quanta. Thus, after its digitalization and the onset of quantum decay, humanity would only milk off, directly from other intelligent living beings on planets and moons, i.e. would not kill anyone. Nevertheless, it would exploit a conscious intelligent living being, depriving it of its voluntary decisions, development, life planning, and perspectives.
It sounds as if the stories of vampires are true or at least have a true core.